In a courtroom brimming with tension, a grim-faced judge, confined to a wheelchair, was on the verge of sentencing a poor father for a crime the man swore he had not committed. It was at that precise moment that the accused's daughter, a little girl of 7, rose to her feet. She walked toward the judge and declared in a steady voice, "Set my father free, and I will make you walk." The chamber erupted in laughter, but the amusement quickly died on their lips as something extraordinary began to unfold, giving way to a stunned silence. On that somber grey morning, the city's courthouse felt less like a hall of justice and more like a cathedral of despair. Its towering walls, lined with endless shelves of ancient legal tomes, had borne witness to decades of unforgiving judgments. At the center of it all, wrapped in the thick black fabric of his robe, Judge Fausto Delene sat motionless in his wheelchair. 15 years had passed since the car accident, a blur of twisted metal and muffled screams that had silenced his legs and, slowly but surely, his heart as well. In the years since, he had cultivated a reputation for unyielding severity. Those who entered his courtroom knew that emotional appeals were useless against Fausto. Before him, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, sat Ramiro Sandoval, a man with a restless gaze and features etched with the exhaustion of someone living perpetually on the edge of survival. A manual laborer and a single father, he stood accused of an armed robbery at a neighborhood pharmacy. The evidence against him seemed insurmountable. Grainy security camera footage, a visual identification, and location records that placed him near the scene of the crime. Yet his eyes pleaded for something more, for the kind of true justice that seemed to be slipping further and further from his grasp. Seated in the rows behind him, a slender girl watched everything, her chin resting on her small hands. She wore a faded blue dress and scuffed sneakers that had seen their share of difficult journeys. Her name was Veronica, and she was only 7 years old, but her eyes held a resolve that few adults could ever muster. The judge meticulously reviewed the latest case documents with precise, almost surgical movements. The room was a sea of reporters hungry for a story, anxious family members, and stoic police officers. The sound of his pen tapping against the wooden bench echoed like the ticking of a clock, counting down the final moments of an innocent man's freedom. Fausto lifted his gaze, his voice cutting through the silence like a sharpened blade. "Before I proceed with the reading of the final verdict, does anyone present wish to add anything relevant to this case?" Not a single hand was raised. The heavy silence held until, like an unexpected spark, a thin, clear, and determined voice rang out through the hall. "I do!" Every head turned. Little Veronica was already on her feet, stepping out from the row where she had been sitting so quietly. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Fausto's brow furrowed, a mix of intrigue and irritation flashing across his face at the interruption. The girl walked to the center of the room with short yet firm steps, each movement infused with a conviction that defied her young age. "I am Ramiro's daughter," she announced, stopping before the elevated podium. "And I have something very important to say before you make a terrible mistake." One of the officers moved to intervene, but the judge raised a hand slightly, his curiosity outweighing his annoyance. His impatient eyes stared her down, as if trying to disarm this small intruder in his domain of rigid laws. "You have 2 minutes, girl, and I hope for your sake you know exactly what you're doing." Veronica took a deep breath, her small fists clenched at her sides. Her words came out with a clarity that surprised even herself. "Release my father, and I will make you walk again." The courtroom seemed to stop in time. A collective gasp was immediately followed by a wave of muffled laughter that echoed off the marble walls. Fausto, however, did not laugh. His jaw tightened. "That's blackmail," he retorted, his voice dripping with ice. "It sounds exactly like the emotional blackmail of a desperate girl trying to save her guilty father." She held his gaze without flinching. "It's not blackmail, Your Honor. It's a sacred promise." The judge leaned forward, his eyes narrowed in suspicion. "Listen closely. This is a serious court of law, and I adhere strictly to the law. What you're suggesting is utterly impossible. It's pure childhood nonsense. My paralysis is irreversible, and this trial is no place for childish games." "But you're not just here to follow cold papers, are you?" she countered with a firmness that was startling for a 7-year-old. "You're here to do the right thing, to see that real justice is done." Fausto gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles turning white. "Justice is found in clear law, and the law demands concrete evidence, proven facts and legal structure, not cheap emotional tricks, not miracles invented by desperate children." The girl took a courageous step forward. "Then let me try, Your Honor. It doesn't have to be all at once, just a little bit. Just enough for you to understand that you can still choose to deliver true justice." Fausto's gaze faltered for an almost imperceptible instant. "This is a respectable court, not a circus," he thought, irritated. But something in the raw sincerity of her words stopped him from shutting it down completely. The room filled with a tense expectation, as if a storm was about to break right then and there. Fausto, though profoundly skeptical, couldn't bring himself to respond immediately. A strange feeling in his chest, perhaps anger mixed with a sliver of curiosity, held him in place. Veronica took another cautious step, as the entire court watched in absolute silence. She stopped directly in front of the judge's chair, her small hands clasped together. The judge looked down at her, his eyes narrowed, as if trying to determine if this was pure madness or something inexplicably greater. "Give me a chance to show you. Just one small chance," Veronica whispered. Fausto hesitated. He didn't say yes, but he couldn't bring himself to say no either. The silence that descended upon the courtroom was as thick as a morning fog. Summoning all her childlike courage, Veronica knelt before the wheelchair and placed her small hands on the judge's motionless knees. Her palms trembled slightly, but her expression was one of absolute concentration. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and began to murmur soft words that sounded like whispers from the heart. It was a sweet rhythmic utterance, not a formal prayer, but filled with a raw, sincere feeling that seemed to pierce through Fausto's invisible armor. The judge kept his expression hard, trying to ignore a gesture he considered utterly childish. The girl squeezed her eyes shut, like someone fighting an unseen pain, whispering with unshakable faith, her fingers pressing lightly against the cold skin as her own knees touched the chilly marble floor. For what felt like an eternity, no one dared to make a sound, until a sarcastic cough shattered the solemn atmosphere. "Come on, little miracle worker, make him dance," a man jeered from the back, sparking the first cruel peals of laughter. Veronica remained perfectly still, as if she hadn't heard the humiliation. Fausto remained completely impassive. Inside, he wanted to end this spectacle immediately, but for a fleeting moment, a part of him doubted. An old, forgotten part of him desperately wished she was right, that there was still room for the impossible. 2 eternal minutes passed. The whispering gradually ceased. Veronica, still kneeling, lifted her face and looked directly at him. Hopeful, vulnerable, brave. Her eyes searched for any sign, a twitch, a flicker of life in those silent legs. But Fausto merely raised an eyebrow slowly and let out a dry, cutting laugh. "Is that it?" he said with cruel disdain. "A pathetic, childish performance. I appreciate your enthusiasm, but as was entirely expected, absolutely nothing happened." His cold laughter opened the floodgates for the cruelty of others. The entire courtroom erupted in malicious laughter. "The miracle has expired," a young man shouted sarcastically. A woman whispered just loud enough for everyone to hear, "Poor thing, she'll be traumatized forever by this humiliation." Ramiro, the father, writhed in the defendant's box, trying desperately to stand, but a guard held him back. "Veronica, my daughter, don't listen to these cruel people." His cry echoed above the deafening noise. The girl, now on her feet with tears rapidly welling in her eyes, looked around, completely lost and humiliated. Her sincere attempt to help had devolved into a devastating public mockery. She tried to breathe, but the lump in her throat was growing tighter, suffocating her. Fausto adjusted his glasses with calculated coldness, cleared his throat, and resumed his judicial posture. "Let us restore order in this respectable court. We have a serious sentence to carry out." He picked up the official document, took a deep breath, and with a firm, relentless voice declared, "Ramiro Sandoval is hereby sentenced to 10 years of imprisonment in a maximum security facility for armed robbery." The little girl couldn't take another second. She ran through the room, pushing past the arms that tried to stop her. The cruel laughter haunted her like demonic echoes. "Going to perform another miracle, little girl," they taunted without mercy. Hot tears streamed down her face as she stumbled out of the courtroom. Ramiro shouted again in despair, but was brutally restrained by the guards. The slam of the heavy door was like a devastating final punctuation mark on a child's hope. Fausto, despite his hardened expression, felt a strange and inexplicable pressure in his chest. "It's better this way," he thought, trying to convince himself. "The law is the law. Feelings have no place in the hammer of justice." And yet, something deep inside didn't feel right at all. A few tense seconds passed. The murmuring continued, but Fausto felt a wave of unexplained nausea. He placed a hand on his stomach, shifted uncomfortably in his chair, and then subtly, he felt a warmth. A faint tingling began to spread through his right calf, something he hadn't felt in 15 long years. "It's not possible. It's psychological. A mental suggestion. A hallucination," he repeated to himself with mounting anxiety. But the tingling gradually intensified. It was as if some ancient, inexplicable force was breathing life into nerves long dead. His hand gripped the armrest with desperate force. The court was still chuckling cruelly, but he was no longer hearing a single thing. The tingling morphed into real heat, then a burning sensation. A pulse, a true living pulse in his motionless legs. Fausto's eyes widened. He tried to hide what was happening, but his breathing was becoming labored. He was breaking into a cold sweat. And then, without rational thought, he pushed against the supports of his chair and forced his trembling body forward, his feet planted firmly on the marble floor. With a shaky but determined effort, he rose slowly, then higher, until he was standing completely upright for the first time in 15 years. The room gradually fell into a deathly silence, as one by one, the laughter ceased. Every person turned to stare at the judge, who stood there, unmoving, supported only by an invisible, inexplicable miracle. No one dared to utter a single word. For 5 eternal seconds, the entire world stopped spinning. Then, like a castle crumbling from within, his body wavered dangerously. His legs gave out completely, and Fausto crashed heavily back into the chair. The impact echoed across the marble floor like a clap of thunder. He tried desperately to get up again, but now everything was exactly as it had been before. Numb, cold, completely immobile. He looked down at his own legs with genuine fear. "I was standing. I felt life," he murmured, unable to find any logic in what had just happened. The crowd didn't know what to say or think. The mockery had completely vanished. All that remained was a sinister, heavy silence, as if they had all witnessed something that could never be explained by human reason. The judge's eyes desperately searched the doorway through which Veronica had fled in tears. She said it was just a test, he remembered, his own voice trembling. For the first time in many years, he was profoundly uncertain. He was facing something far beyond cold reason, something that perhaps, in all his professional rigor, he had completely forgotten existed. True faith. And though he remained seated, even though he no longer had control over his legs, he knew with absolute certainty that the courageous little girl had spoken the purest truth he had heard in decades of trials. The following day dawned overcast, as if the sky itself didn't know what emotion to feel. Inside the official car, Fausto watched the streets pass by slowly, his hands trembling as he gripped the arms of his wheelchair like anchors. Since the inexplicable episode in the courtroom, he couldn't think of anything else. Those 5 seconds on his feet had shattered everything he believed to be unchangeable about his condition. It was like having his legs back only to lose them again, being thrown back into darkness after seeing a brilliant flash of light. But what echoed most loudly in his mind was the question he desperately tried to avoid. Why did it last for such a short time? And why did it happen right after he had humiliated an innocent child? When he arrived at the municipal shelter, he was met with looks of suspicion and fear. A judge was here. That always meant serious trouble for someone. But on this different morning, he didn't seem threatening. There was something new in his eyes, an inexplicable weight that hadn't been there before. The staff led him to an inner courtyard where Veronica was all alone, sitting under an old tree, tearing small pieces of paper and letting them fly away on the wind like sad butterflies. When she saw him approaching, she didn't react. She kept her eyes fixed on the ground, avoiding any contact. Fausto stopped his chair a few feet away, respecting the wounded girl's space. "Veronica," he said, his tone much softer than he intended, "I really need to talk to you." She looked up slowly but said nothing. Her eyes still carried the pain of the public humiliation. Fausto hesitated for a long moment, then spoke with brutal honesty. "Yesterday, for a few impossible seconds, I walked." Veronica nodded slowly, no surprise on her face. "But then I lost it all again. It was as if it was violently ripped away from me." The judge looked down at his nervous hands. "You said it was a test, but why only 5 seconds? Why didn't it last?" The girl pressed her lips together, took a deep breath, and answered with a startling firmness, "Because you didn't do the right thing. God would never allow someone who commits a terrible injustice to remain standing." Fausto's eyes widened in genuine surprise. "Injustice," he repeated, almost offended. "I rigorously followed all the evidence presented. I applied the law as it is written." The girl approached him slowly, looking him directly in the eyes with impressive courage. "The law of cold paper, not the law of the warm heart." He frowned, confused. "What exactly do you mean by that?" Veronica carefully pulled a small pen drive, protected with faded blue adhesive tape, from her pocket. It was hidden behind the neighbor's broken television. My dad installed a camera when people started breaking into houses on our street. She explained that it had recorded the entire terrible night, and she held out the device with small but steady hands. I was very sick, with a high fever. He was taking care of me at the exact moment of the crime. He didn't leave the house for a single minute. Fausto took the device with trembling hands. "Is there clear audio?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. She nodded with absolute certainty. "You can hear my bad cough. You can hear him saying he was going to miss work to stay with me. You can hear him making soup and singing quietly to help me sleep." Her words came out stronger. "He couldn't have robbed that pharmacy, Your Honor. He was at home with me, taking care of his sick daughter." The judge sighed deeply, as if something heavy inside him had silently shattered. "No one presented this at the trial." Veronica shook her head sadly. "The police didn't even want to listen properly. They just tossed everything aside. They said a child doesn't understand anything." For several eternal seconds, the judge remained in absolute silence, staring at the small object that held the truth. There, in that seemingly simple thing, was the line that separated error from repair, injustice from redemption. "You were right from the very beginning," he murmured, unable to look at the girl. She sat down carefully beside his chair, hugging her knees. "It's not about being right," she said in an almost wise whisper. "It's about doing the right thing, even when it's hard." Fausto closed his eyes tightly. "And what if it's too late to fix it?" The girl answered without hesitation. "If you truly try, it's never too late for justice." The judge looked at her with a mixture of astonishment and profound respect. This small, brave girl spoke with a wisdom that shattered all the walls he had built around his heart. "I'm going to reopen the case completely," he finally said with growing determination. "But I can't do this alone. I'm going to need help." Veronica looked at him intently. "And what can I do? I'm just a child." He managed a slight smile for the first time in years. "Help me be better. Be my watchful eyes, my listening ears, my conscience that refuses to be silenced." The proposition seemed utterly absurd to any rational person, but in that moment, it made more sense than anything he had done in the last 15 years. Veronica hesitated, then nodded seriously. "Okay, but only if I can go with you wherever you need to go." Fausto extended his hand in a solemn gesture. "Deal." They shook on it like two unlikely partners, a man in a heavy robe and a girl in a faded blue dress. Two lives that fate should never have crossed, but who were now walking in the same sacred direction. As they left the shelter together, Fausto felt a faint, familiar prickling in his legs. Weak, but unmistakably real. Maybe there is still time, he thought with renewed hope. Veronica walked beside his chair with short but completely determined steps. The shelter was behind them, and ahead lay a case to reopen, a terrible injustice to undo, and perhaps a miracle yet to be completed. What had begun with pure faith would now continue with hard work. But inside both of them, there was something entirely new, a true alliance. The makeshift office table was completely buried under important papers, black and white photos, and urgently printed documents. Among them, connected to an old laptop, was the pen drive Veronica had delivered like a key to the truth. The recording was crystal clear. The image showed Ramiro preparing homemade soup, placing cool cloths on his feverish daughter's forehead, and murmuring tenderly, "You need to get better quickly, little one. Daddy isn't going to leave your side for a second." With each careful replay of the video, Fausto felt less tense, but also more guilty. His focus was no longer just technical and legal. There was something much deeper at play, an emotional restlessness he didn't quite know how to name. Veronica, sitting patiently beside him, observed everything in respectful silence. She didn't ask unnecessary questions. She just watched. But when Fausto sighed for the 5th time in less than a minute, she dared to ask, "Were you always like this? So serious and closed off?" The question caught him completely off guard. "Like what?" She shrugged with the cruel frankness of children. "I don't know. It's like you were born already old and sad." The sentence was delivered with such simplicity that Fausto blinked twice and let out a low laugh that surprised even himself. Her eyes widened in genuine shock. "What? You actually know how to laugh?" He composed himself, clearing his throat in embarrassment. "Sometimes, but usually not during serious work," she replied with a mischievous and disarming smile. "Then it's a good thing we're working on making you smile too, right?" Throughout the afternoon, between hefty files and technical reports, she would ask completely unexpected questions that caught him off guard. Did you ever have a pet cat? When you were a kid, did you like to run barefoot in the rain? What was your favorite food before you wore that heavy robe? With each innocent provocation, an old internal wall slowly crumbled. Fausto tried to maintain his professional composure, but his eyes were gradually softening, and every now and then, a genuine smile would escape involuntarily. Veronica would pretend to mark points in an invisible notebook every time he smiled naturally. "Another point for Team Joy," she'd say with comic seriousness. It was a silent but determined war against years of emotional rigidity, and she was winning without ever raising her voice. At one point, she pointed to an old photograph hanging on the wall, an official portrait of the judge in his robes, still standing, taken years before the accident. "You looked happy back then." He stared at the image for a long moment before answering honestly, "I was busy and proud of my work." The girl tilted her head thoughtfully. "But busy and proud isn't exactly the same as being happy, is it?" Fausto fell silent, touched more deeply than he wanted to admit. No, it wasn't. And without quite knowing why, he began to tell her about the devastating accident, the chronic pain that followed, the gradual distancing from friends, the coldness he adopted as armor against further suffering. Veronica listened with completely attentive eyes, never rushing him. "And you think you became like that just because you couldn't walk anymore?" Fausto reflected deeply. "I think I stopped walking on the inside too. I stopped trying to be happy." She moved a little closer, like someone offering a safe space for a frightened bird to land. "So, let's start walking again. But this time, from the inside first." The judge gave a short, almost uncomfortable laugh, but he didn't deny the wisdom in her words. In fact, a part of him craved more of these conversations, of these carefree, judgment-free looks. It was as if every sincere sentence the girl spoke was carefully cleaning the long-neglected, dusty corners of his soul. It's amazing how a child's perspective can change everything, isn't it? If you want more stories that explore these deep connections, make sure you're subscribed to True Light and have that notification bell turned on. Between one technical statement and the next, Veronica would insist on interrupting with questions that had absolutely nothing to do with the legal case. "If you were an animal, what would you be?" He rolled his eyes with feigned irritation. "A hawk, silent, observant, solitary." She laughed heartily. "I think you'd be an armadillo. You curl up into a ball when you're scared." Fausto looked at her and laughed for real. "You're right. Maybe an armadillo in a black robe." The office, once cold and utterly austere, was beginning to feel like something he hadn't experienced in years. a place pulsating with real life. And as much as he tried to convince himself that the focus was exclusively on Ramiro's case, Fausto knew something much bigger was happening. His thoughts were no longer confined to cold laws and penal codes. He was starting to ask himself simple, almost forgotten questions. What was my favorite color as a child? What made me laugh before this heavy robe? And all of this was happening because a brave little girl, instead of fearing the stern judge, had chosen to confront him with sincere questions and the pure courage to love, even after being publicly humiliated by him. At the end of that productive evening, as they carefully organized the papers, Veronica commented casually, "You know what I think? I think you're not just getting better because of the miracle. You're getting better because you're letting good things back into your heart." Fausto didn't reply immediately. He just looked at her for a few seconds, with a slight smile on his lips and an almost hopeful gaze. Something fundamental was changing inside him. And maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of a healing far deeper than the physical, one that couldn't be seen, but could be felt, born there in their shared silence. The following days were intensely filled with enormous stacks of paper, forgotten cold coffee, and hours of concentrated silence. Fausto and Veronica had transformed the judge's office into a veritable center for detailed investigation. While she meticulously organized documents by date and relevance, he delved deep into expert reports, contradictory testimonies, and police files. His trained eyes scrutinized every line with surgical precision, and it was there, between one page and another of the original case file, that Fausto stopped abruptly. A small detail, almost imperceptible to a less attentive eye. The detailed report from Officer Henrique, the arresting officer, was formally dated the day before the official collection of evidence. He froze. This makes no sense at all. Holding the sheet between his trembling fingers, Fausto reread it aloud. It describes the crime scene with details that a person could only know after a thorough evaluation. And this was submitted before that evaluation was officially conducted. Veronica came closer, curious and concerned. Does that mean he already knew everything before he investigated? The judge nodded gravely, his gaze darkening with a terrible understanding. It means he wrote about something that had not yet been officially verified. Either he has supernatural powers of divination, or someone is blatantly lying. The tension in the air became palpable, suffocating. Fausto leaned back in his chair, pressing his temples with his fingers as he processed the devastating discovery. Or he deliberately forged evidence to frame an innocent man. Later that night, Fausto retrieved a folder he had filed away years ago, filled with side notes on the questionable conduct of several officers. Henrique's name appeared in at least 3 serious internal incidents. One for coercing vulnerable witnesses, another for the convenient loss of evidence, and a third, more serious one, for strong suspicion of planting false evidence at crime scenes. All neatly filed away, without a proper in-depth investigation. "He's much more than a corrupt cop," Fausto muttered with rising indignation. "He's a predator in uniform, lurking in the dark corridors of the force." Henrique was known for his explosive temper, his calculated coldness with defenseless suspects, and above all, his intimidating ability to silence anyone who dared to question him or his dubious methods. Fausto shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his body reacting with physical outrage. That man systematically manipulated everything, and no one wanted to see the truth right in front of their eyes. Veronica watched him in respectful silence, sensing that the judge wasn't just speaking as a distant legal authority. He was speaking as someone finally awakening to painful truths long ignored. "We urgently need a formal reconsideration hearing," he declared with renewed determination. Veronica, holding a heavy file in her lap, looked at him with cautious hope. "Does that mean you'll be able to change the terrible sentence?" He nodded firmly. "If we can conclusively prove deliberate fraud, I can completely annul the unjust conviction." That same day, Fausto meticulously drafted the formal request for reopening. As he submitted the crucial document to the court clerk's office, a tense, expectant silence fell. A few hours later, the judge was urgently summoned to the private office of a veteran prosecutor, someone he had known since their tough days in law school. The room was deliberately dim, the blinds carefully angled to create an intimidating atmosphere. "Are you absolutely sure about what you're doing, Fausto?" The voice was dangerously calm, laced with a veiled threat. "Completely sure," he replied without hesitation. The other man rose slowly, like a predator circling its prey. "Reopening a recently sentenced case based on the flimsy claims of a desperate child is professional suicide." Fausto didn't respond immediately, just held his gaze firm. The prosecutor took a menacing step forward. "Are you really going to throw it all away? Your entire reputation, your respected career, for a little girl who appeared out of nowhere claiming she could make you walk?" There was distilled venom in those words, but also a genuine fear. "That brave girl saw more truth than you and I have in 30 years of wearing heavy robes," Fausto replied with unshakable firmness. "You don't understand the consequences of what you're starting." The judge turned toward the door with determination. "Then, prepare the bill. I'm willing to pay any price for true justice." In the official car, during the silent ride back home, Fausto stared out the window, his face tense, reflecting the gravity of the situation. The veiled threat still echoed in his ears, but something infinitely stronger was pulsing in his chest. The vivid memory of that sacred moment when his legs had responded, however briefly. The girl's innocent faith had left a sacred mark on his soul, a quiet but inextinguishable flame that now fueled all of his renewed courage. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling his resolve grow. This is no longer just about Ramiro, he thought. It's about challenging an entire corrupt system and proving that true justice can still exist. Veronica was waiting patiently for him on the courthouse steps, sitting with a worn-out backpack on her lap. Seeing him approach, she ran to the official car door. "So, did we do it?" Fausto carefully got out with the driver's help and simply announced, "We did it. A new hearing is set for exactly 4 days from now." The girl beamed victoriously, her eyes shining. "So now you're like a superhero in a tie, huh?" The judge rolled his eyes with feigned irritation. "Don't get your hopes up." But inside, something in him was genuinely smiling too. She had a way of naming feelings he didn't know how to express, and little by little, his heart was beginning to believe in possibilities again. Night advanced silently over the sleeping city, but inside the small rented house where Fausto and Veronica had taken refuge to work, something weighed heavily in the air. A disquieting premonition. The thick curtains were drawn tight, muffling the normal sounds of the street, and the dim lamps cast long, distorted shadows on the peeling walls. Seated at the makeshift table, the judge reviewed the final crucial documents for the formal complaint against Henrique, while the girl, sitting on the floor surrounded by open folders, read quietly to herself. The only constant sound was the hypnotic ticking of an old kitchen clock, but there was something deeply strange about this particular night, a silence that didn't feel natural. as if unseen danger was just waiting for the exact moment to violently knock on the door. That's when the first sign came, a dry, menacing click from outside. The judge lifted his head on high alert. "Did you hear that?" he murmured, his tension rising. Veronica stopped reading, suddenly frightened. "It sounds like someone is messing around behind the house." Fausto moved slowly toward the window, but before he could lean out to investigate, the back door was violently kicked in with a brutal, deafening crash. The wooden frame splintered into pieces. The judge whipped his wheelchair around, completely defenseless and vulnerable. And then the sinister figure appeared. It was Henrique, his eyes feverish and desperate, his face sweating with rage, a heavy gun in his trembling hand, a monster finally unleashed. "Game over, you meddling judge!" he snarled, his voice hoarse. Time froze. Fausto instinctively tried to back his chair away, but hit the wall with no escape. His trembling hands gripped the armrests, completely helpless. "Henrique, think carefully about what you're doing," he said, trying to keep his voice steady, though inside his heart threatened to explode with terror. The corrupt officer pointed the gun directly at the judge's chest. "You should have kept your mouth shut like a good boy, but you couldn't. You had to play the hero for some insignificant brat." Just then, Veronica appeared bravely in the bedroom doorway. Her eyes met the judge's in panic, then locked onto the threatening gun. Without a second thought, she screamed and charged, throwing her small body against Henrique. The impact caught him completely by surprise. The gun flew from his hand, skidding dangerously across the wooden floor. The two of them fell in a tangle on the rug, and she began to scream, kick and bite like a small animal fighting for its life. "Don't touch him! Don't touch my friend!" she yelled with all the force of her lungs. Fausto, terrified, desperately shouted the girl's name, but he was trapped in his chair, watching helplessly as chaos unfolded right in front of him. Henrique, furious and humiliated, shoved her brutally against the wall. She stumbled and fell, but immediately scrambled back to her feet, her chest heaving with determination. The officer quickly retrieved the gun and aimed again, this time at both of them. "Now you're both going to learn what happens to people who mess with me," he growled, cocking the weapon with a terrible metallic sound. Time seemed to stop completely. Veronica, trembling but fearless, stood bravely in front of Fausto, as if her fragile body could somehow shield him from death. "If you want to do something to him, you'll have to go through me first," she declared, her voice choked with fear, but firm in its resolve. Outside, the street seemed completely deserted. Death stood in the middle of their living room, ready to claim two innocent lives. It was then, in a miracle of perfect timing sent from the heavens, that the shrill, life-saving wail of police sirens shattered the deadly silence like liberating thunder. Flashing red and blue lights pulsed through the window. Henrique spun around, surprised and hesitant, and in that split second of distraction, the front door was smashed open. "Police! Drop the weapon now!" shouted real officers, storming the house with their guns drawn. Henrique froze for an instant, his finger still dangerously on the trigger, but he had no time to react. He was tackled by two experienced officers and efficiently pinned to the floor. The gun slid far from his reach. A vigilant neighbor had seen a strange man entering through the back of the house, and suspecting something was wrong, had called the police immediately. Thankfully, a patrol car was nearby, arriving just in time to save two lives. Henrique was handcuffed, still swearing and struggling uselessly, but this time there was no escape. His uncontrolled rage had finally been contained by true justice. An experienced paramedic carefully examined Veronica, who now seemed calmer, though still visibly shaken by the trauma. She held the judge's hand with desperate strength, saying nothing, just looking at him with eyes full of unshed tears. After a few minutes of heavy silence, Fausto finally managed to murmur in a broken voice, "You really saved my life." The girl looked at him tenderly, her own voice thick with emotion. "And you believed in my dad when no one else in the whole world did." Fausto squeezed her small hand even tighter. "I will never doubt you again, little warrior." She managed a firm smile, still breathing heavily. "Then now we're completely even." And there, among the splinters of wood scattered across the floor, the tension still palpable, and the ragged breaths, something was born that isn't written in any law or taught in any legal textbook. A deep and silent alliance between a man wounded by life and a girl who flatly refused to stop fighting for the truth. Finally, the big day had arrived. The new hearing was officially scheduled for 9 in the morning, but the courtroom was already practically full before 8. Experienced lawyers, news-hungry journalists, anxious family members, and curious onlookers from all over. Everyone wanted to be there to witness the historic return of the Sandoval case. More than that, they all wanted to see Judge Fausto Delin in action for themselves. The sensationalist newspaper headlines had described the hearing as a circus spectacle. The judge who walked for 5 seconds, divine miracle, or psychological manipulation. But for those truly involved in this battle for justice, it represented much more than a simple news story. It was true justice, finally waiting to be served. Veronica arrived punctually, accompanied by Ramiro, her small hands clasped firmly in his. Her father looked around with understandable suspicion. After all, courtrooms had brought him nothing but pain. But the girl walked with her head held high, with an impressive dignity. Her light blue dress seemed more vibrant and hopeful on this decisive morning. The entire room fell into a reverent silence as the side doors solemnly opened. And there he was, Fausto Delin, standing, leaning gracefully on an elegant cane, wearing his black robes like the silent armor of justice. Every step he took was a direct challenge to expectations, a testament to determination. He didn't walk with technical perfection, but he walked with a dignity that transcended any physical limitation. And when he presented himself majestically before the packed court, the murmurs ceased completely. Everyone knew instinctively that something different and historic was about to happen. "Ladies and gentlemen," the judge began, his voice firm with renewed authority. "This hearing has been convened following the presentation of crucial new evidence that fundamentally calls into question the conviction of Ramiro Sandoval." There was no unnecessary emotion on his face, but any attentive person could see something entirely new in his eyes, an intense flame of moral certainty. The prosecution tried desperately to contain the devastating impact of the revelations, but it was soon completely overwhelmed by the crushing weight of the evidence presented. First, the pen drive with the recorded footage from inside Ramiro's home, showing incontrovertibly that he was lovingly caring for his sick daughter at the exact moment the crime was being committed on the other side of town. Then, the detailed medical records and pharmacy receipts that had been conveniently and criminally omitted from the previous trial. But the final definitive proof, the one that sealed the case's fate forever, was the detailed report of the brutal assault attempt on Fausto and Veronica the night before. Clear footage from the police station, precise medical reports, the weapon found in Henrique's possession, compelling testimonies from frightened neighbors, photographs of the violently forced door. Henrique, present in the courtroom in handcuffs between two guards, kept his face tense and defeated, but could deny absolutely nothing. The evidence was irrefutable. The prosecutor, left with no defensible arguments, offered a public apology to the defense, and Fausto, with a slightly trembling hand but a steady voice, uttered the words everyone was waiting for. In light of the evidence presented and the violent attempt to obstruct justice, this court solemnly declares that Ramiro Sandoval is completely innocent of all charges. His conviction is formally annulled. The courtroom erupted in emotional applause. Veronica brought her hands to her mouth in genuine shock before running desperately into her father's arms. Ramiro lifted her up, spinning her around as tears of relief streamed freely down his face. "You saved me, my brave daughter," he murmured, his voice choked with emotion. "No, Daddy," she said, looking directly at the judge with profound gratitude. "We all saved each other." Fausto watched the touching scene, a lump forming in his throat, but there was still something important left to do. Veronica slowly pulled away from her father and walked with determined steps toward the judge. The court once again fell into respectful silence. She stopped right in front of the chair where he had sat down to rest. "May I?" she asked, her eyes shining with hope. Fausto nodded with a genuine smile. The girl knelt reverently, as if before something truly sacred. Her hands touched the judge's legs again, but this time with a different, more mature firmness. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and began to speak with a pure emotion that plunged the entire room into absolute silence. "And I know it's still hard, but now that you have truly done the right thing, I ask that God finishes what He started that first day." She began to weep silently as she whispered, not tears of sadness but of total surrender and unshakable faith. Her words trembled in the air like invisible incense. "For everything you have done, for defending what was just, even when it was dangerous, I now ask God to complete what was still missing." The girl's hands pressed gently on Fausto's knees, but there was an undeniable spiritual force there. Absolute faith, complete trust. She was shaking all over, but didn't stop praying. "Before, you walked on a promise. Now, walk forever in the truth." What happened this time was completely different. Slow, profound, definitive. Fausto's legs began to awaken with a growing tingle, but it was no longer the fleeting sensation of the first miracle. It was as if something that had been dormant for 15 long years was finally stirring within him. His muscles contracted with new life, nerves responded with clear signals, and then, without the support of the cane, without hesitation, he rose firmly and remained standing. A murmur of astonishment swept through the room, followed by emotional tears, thunderous applause, and shouts of joy. Veronica smiled through her tears, still kneeling like a little saint. Fausto looked at his own legs in awe, and then at her with infinite gratitude. "It was you all along," he murmured, his voice breaking with emotion. She replied with touching simplicity, "It was God. I just asked for the right thing this time, when your heart was already prepared. The jury, the lawyers, the journalists, everyone was on their feet. Some were applauding fervently, others were crying openly. But no one left that room the same way they had entered. In that court where justice was so often just a cold, empty name, something infinitely greater had manifested itself, not just in the miraculously healed body of the judge, but in the deeply touched souls of everyone present. And finally, Fausto Delaine, the man who for 15 years had turned to stone, looked at the little girl with eyes moist with gratitude and solemnly declared, "True justice has been done." and for the first time in decades, absolutely everyone in the room agreed with all their hearts. The courthouse had been well and truly transformed. Ramiro and Veronica left the historic building without handcuffs, without prison uniforms, without fear, just hand in hand, descending the steps in a sacred silence. Outside, the sky seemed extraordinarily blue, as if the universe itself had heaved a deep sigh of relief. Some people applauded them enthusiastically. Others waved with genuine affection, but they didn't say a word. The victory had been too intimate to be expressed in mere human words. They went straight home, to the simple, humble house where it had all begun. Ramiro was still trying to understand how, amidst all the world's cruel injustices, his small daughter had managed to move entire mountains through pure faith. Veronica just wanted to sleep in the safe embrace of her father, and they fell asleep just like that, as if the whole world could fit inside that tight hug. A few quiet days passed, and the family routine slowly returned. Ramiro cleaned the kitchen, whistling softly, and hung washed clothes on the line out back. Veronica sat on the cool living room floor, drawing intently, coloring a picture of a man in a black robe and a girl in a blue dress, holding hands with crayons. The title of the drawing was written in crooked, childish letters: "The Judge Who Learned to Walk and Smile." They weren't expecting visitors that afternoon. That's why when they heard the familiar creak of the iron gate opening, they both looked at each other in curious silence. There he was, Fausto Deline, walking without a cane, wearing a casual light grey jacket and holding a simple bouquet of daisies. They were Veronica's mother's favourite flowers, a detail he had carefully learned from the case files. A seemingly simple gesture, but one that said everything about his inner transformation. Ramiro walked to the gate with measured, cautious steps. The two men looked at each other for a long, silent moment. No formal robes between them, no judge's gavel, no institutional distance. Just two fathers marked by completely different battles, but united by the same pursuit of justice. Fausto extended the bouquet with genuine humility. "It's not much, but it was the most beautiful thing I could find." Ramiro took the flowers delicately, holding them with reverent care. Then he took a deep breath, preparing for words he never imagined he would say. Fausto looked him directly in the eyes and spoke, his voice cracking but firm. "Ramiro, please forgive me completely. I failed you terribly. I condemned you when I should have protected you. I almost destroyed your family out of pure arrogance." For an eternal moment, the silence was absolute. Ramiro didn't hesitate for a second. He clutched the flowers to his chest, took a deep breath, and replied with a serenity that only someone who has suffered greatly can possess. "You came back. That's what really matters. I forgive you truly, with a completely clean heart." These words were spoken with such humility and sincerity that they completely disarmed what remained of the pain and guilt in the judge's eyes. And then, something that had seemed impossible happened. They embraced without unnecessary words, just the pure gesture. A silence that wasn't heavy, but liberating. Veronica appeared at the door of the house, peeking at the scene with eyes bright with joy. Seeing the two men separate from the hug, she ran towards them and wrapped her arms around the judge's waist in a tight embrace. "I thought you weren't going to visit us anymore." Fausto smiled genuinely, stroking her head with paternal tenderness. "It took me so long because I was trying to figure out the right way to thank you for everything you did." The girl pointed toward the modest house. "Want to come in? We have guava juice." He hesitated for only a second, then nodded with human warmth. It would be an honor. And so, the three of them went inside together, as if they had done it 1,000 times. as if that moment was the true starting point of a completely new story. In the small backyard, the afternoon sun painted everything in a magical golden light. A light, fragrant breeze rustled the leaves in the trees. Veronica, excited and mischievous, turned on an old radio that only tuned into 2 stations, and always with static. A slow song began to play, half cheesy, half beautiful, the kind that used to play when they were kids. She looked at the judge with a completely mischievous smile. "If you can walk that well, I bet you can also dance." Fausto laughed, trying to hide behind his dignity. "Don't get your hopes up." But she insisted, extending her hand as if making a solemn invitation to a royal ball. "Just one dance. I promise I won't record it to show anyone." Ramiro watched from a distance, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed and a discreet but genuine smile on his face. Fausto accepted the invitation, with initially clumsy steps and a slight tremor in his knees. Still not completely used to it, he took Veronica's small hand and began to spin with her in the middle of the humble courtyard. The dance was more of an affectionate stumble than technical steps, but the joy was real and contagious. With every turn, with every spontaneous laugh, whatever had been broken inside each of them seemed to be carefully mending itself, piece by piece. Veronica twirled with natural lightness, as if she were born to dance. Fausto, despite all his historical rigidity, let himself be completely carried away by the music and the moment. The judge, once made of cold stone, now danced as if he were floating. The music ended softly, but they continued to spin there in silence, swayed by a melody only they could hear. The sun was setting majestically on the horizon, painting the entire sky in vibrant orange and delicate pink. The radio hissed on its own, but in that magical moment there were no unjust convictions, no limiting wheelchairs, no threatening prosecutors or broken-down doors. There was only a courageous girl, a hard-working father, and a man who had been saved by both of them through unconditional love. And it was no longer just about legal justice, but about complete healing, about a true new beginning, about grace received and shared. Fausto stopped to catch his breath, panting, but with tears of pure gratitude in his eyes. He looked at Ramiro, then at Veronica, and finally managed to say, "Thank you for not giving up on me when I had already given up on myself." The girl came closer, taking both of his hands in her small ones. "You just needed a little push to remember who you really were on the inside." V. Fausto laughed out loud for the first time, and it was the first time in 15 years that he had truly laughed from the bottom of his heart. And so, between genuine laughter, simple flowers, and steps still clumsy but full of life, ended a story that was never just about cold laws or legal codes, but about unshakable faith, precious second chances, and the inexplicable power that only a 7-year-old girl has to teach a wounded man how to walk again, not just with his legs, but most importantly, with his heart. If you were moved by this story of faith, courage, and second chances, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to see more content that touches the heart. Leave a like to support us and activate notifications so you don't miss anything new. This helps us a lot to continue creating the best content for you. Until the next story, and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I'll read all the comments. Our stories are crossing hearts and borders, and your presence here makes it all worthwhile. Write in the comments, "I'm watching from," your city or country. It will be beautiful to see this map of emotions forming in the comments.